I pulled into my driveway at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days earlier than planned, and found 30 strangers trampling my wildflower meadow, while a woman in a cream-colored blazer stood on my front porch with a microphone, selling my ranch to the highest bidder. Lot 17 includes the original 1890s farmhouse, 43 acres of prime grazing land, and exclusive water rights to Cottonwood Creek, she announced to the crowd of potential buyers spread across my lawn like locusts. Opening bid starts at $800,000. I sat frozen in my truck engine, still running, trying to process what I was seeing. Red and white balloons tied to my fence posts. A professional auction banner stretched between my oak trees. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows where my cattle should have been grazing. And standing at the center of it all, microphone in one perfectly manicured hand, was Rebecca Morrison, the woman who had been trying to force me out of my home for the past 2 years. Rebecca spotted me before I could even open my door. Her smile faltered for exactly 1 second before she composed herself, raised the microphone, and said with saccharine sweetness, "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have an uninvited guest. Security, please escort this individual from the premises." I stepped out of my truck slowly, my boots hitting gravel that had been in my family for 4 generations. "Security," I called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Lady, this is my land. You are trespassing." But Rebecca was already dialing 911. "My name is Thomas McKenna, and I am a 58-year-old retired Marine Corps colonel who inherited McKenna Ranch from my grandfather in 2019. The property sits on 240 acres in the Texas Hill Country, about 30 miles outside Austin, and it has been in my family since 1887. When my grandfather died, he left me everything: the land, the house, the mineral rights, and most importantly, the senior water rights to Cottonwood Creek that runs through the eastern boundary. I never wanted to be a rancher. After 26 years in the Marines, I had planned to move to a small house near the coast and spend my retirement fishing. But standing on that front porch for the first time, looking out over rolling hills, dotted with live oaks and wildflowers, something in my chest loosened. This was not just land. This was legacy. The trouble started 6 months after I moved in, when the Willowbrook Heights development broke ground on the adjacent property. Willowbrook Heights was not just any subdivision, it was a luxury planned community with million-dollar homes, a golf course, and enough HOA regulations to choke a horse. The marketing materials promised residents an exclusive lifestyle experience, with careful attention to community standards and property values. What they did not mention was that their fancy development had a water problem. Rebecca Morrison, the HOA president and self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Heights, showed up at my door on a blazing July afternoon wearing a white linen dress and an expression that suggested she would rather be anywhere else. She was exactly what you would expect from an HOA president. Mid-40s, perfectly styled blonde hair, manicured nails, and the kind of smile that looked painted on ass. "Mr. McKenna," she said, extending a hand I did not take. "I am Rebecca Morrison from Willowbrook Heights. I hope you do not mind me stopping by unannounced, but we have a small situation that I am hoping you can help us resolve." I had been fixing a gate hinge when she arrived, and I did not put down my tools. "What kind of situation?" Her smile tightened slightly. "Well, it seems there has been some confusion about water usage rights in this area. Our development was designed with certain assumptions about creek access, and our homeowners are experiencing some challenges with their irrigation systems." "Sounds like a planning problem," I said. "Indeed." She pulled out a manila folder thick enough to be a novel. "However, we have done some research, and it appears there may be some flexibility in the existing water rights allocation. We would like to propose a partnership that would benefit everyone involved." I set down my wrench and gave her my full attention. "What kind of partnership?" "Willowbrook Heights would like to purchase a portion of your water rights. We are prepared to offer you $500,000 for a 20% allocation of your creek access. It is really quite generous. You would still retain the majority of your rights, and you would have enough money to make some wonderful improvements to your property." I almost laughed. "Almost. Lady, those water rights are worth more than your entire development. And they are not for sale." The painted smile cracked slightly. "I am sure if you take some time to consider, the answer is no. And unless you have got business here beyond trying to buy something that is not for sale, you are trespassing." That was mistake number 1. I should have known Rebecca Morrison was not the type of woman who accepted no gracefully. The harassment started small. A certified letter arrived the following week, informing me that my property was in violation of community standards and demanding I remove the unsightly agricultural equipment visible from Willowbrook Heights. The letter was printed on official-looking letterhead and cited several county ordinances I had allegedly violated. I called the county office. None of the ordinances existed. Next came the complaint about my cattle. According to Rebecca, my cows were creating environmental concerns by grazing near the creek. She had filed a formal complaint with the county environmental office, complete with photos, and a list of affected residents who were concerned about water contamination. The county inspector who showed up was a tired-looking man named Rodriguez, who spent about 10 minutes looking at my cattle and another 5 minutes checking my water quality reports. "Your livestock operation is completely compliant," he told me. "In fact, your rotational grazing is probably improving the creek ecosystem. Whoever filed this complaint does not know what they are talking about. Can you put that in writing?" He handed me a form. "Already did. And Mr. McKenna, you might want to know that this is the third frivolous complaint we have received about your property in the past month. Someone is wasting a lot of county resources on harassment." The pattern continued. Noise complaints about my tractor filed during normal working hours. Allegations that I was running an illegal business because I sold hay to neighbors. Claims that my property was attracting dangerous wildlife. Apparently deer and turkey were now considered threats. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but each one cost me time, stress, and money for legal consultation. The real escalation began when Rebecca started targeting my access road. My ranch is accessible via a private easement that crosses a corner of what is now Willowbrook Heights property. The easement is clearly documented in my deed and has been in use since 1887, long before any development existed. But one morning in October, I found my access road blocked by construction equipment and a sign reading "Private Property No Trespassing." I called Rebecca's office. She was unavailable, but her assistant informed me that Willowbrook Heights was reviewing all easement agreements for compliance with current development standards. In the meantime, I was welcome to use the alternative access route. They had identified a path that required driving 3 miles out of my way through town. That is when I hired Emma Rodriguez, a property rights attorney, who had been recommended by the county inspector. Emma was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, who specialized in easement disputes and had a reputation for not backing down from bullies. "They cannot block your easement," she told me, after reviewing my deed, "but they are hoping you do not know that it is a classic intimidation tactic. Make your life difficult enough that you will accept their original offer just to make the problems go away." What is my next move? We file for an injunction to reopen your access, and we put them on notice that any further harassment will result in a lawsuit. But Tom, I need you to understand something. This woman is not going to give up easily. People like Rebecca Morrison see compromise as weakness. If you want to fight this, you need to be prepared for it to get worse before it gets better. I thought about my grandfather who had fought drought, depression, and developers to keep this land in the family. I am not backing down. Emma smiled. Good. Because I think we can do more than just defend. I think we can win. The injunction hearing was scheduled for the 15th of November, but Rebecca had other plans. On the 10th of November, I returned from a supply run to find surveyor's stakes driven into my pasture and a crew of men measuring my fence line. When I asked what they were doing, the crew chief showed me a work order from Willowbrook Heights authorizing a boundary clarification survey. Whose boundary? I asked. He shrugged. Lady who hired us says there has been some confusion about where your property ends and theirs begins. She has got documentation that suggests your fence might be encroaching on HOA land. I called Emma immediately. They are trying to steal my land now. Do not let them do any work, she said. I am calling for an emergency hearing. And Tom, start documenting everything. Photos, videos, witnesses. We are going to need evidence. The emergency hearing was a disaster for Rebecca. Judge Patricia Holbrook was a 70-year-old former rancher who had no patience for HOA overreach. When Rebecca's attorney tried to argue that the survey was necessary to clarify ambiguous boundary descriptions, Judge Holbrook pulled out a magnifying glass and spent 10 minutes examining my original deed. "Counselor," she said finally, "this boundary description is about as ambiguous as a brick to the head. Your client has no standing to survey Mr. McKenna's property, no right to block his easement, and no authority to harass him with frivolous complaints. If I see any of these parties in my courtroom again for anything other than a legitimate legal dispute, someone is going to jail for contempt." The survey crew was gone by the time I got home, but they had left something behind: tire tracks leading straight to Cottonwood Creek and evidence that someone had been taking water samples from my side of the property line. That is when I realized Rebecca was not just trying to buy my water rights. She was trying to find a way to take them. I started doing my own research, and what I found made my blood boil. Willowbrook Heights had been built with an irrigation system designed for twice the water allocation they actually possessed. The developer had assumed they could purchase additional water rights from surrounding properties, but when those negotiations fell through, the HOA was left with angry homeowners whose expensive landscaping was dying and golf course that could not maintain its greens. But here is what Rebecca did not know. I had not just inherited land and water rights. I had also inherited my grandfather's files, including his correspondence with a geologist who had surveyed the property in 1987. According to that survey, Cottonwood Creek was fed by an underground spring that originated entirely on McKenna Ranch property. The creek did not just run through my land, it started on my land. Emma's eyes lit up when I showed her the geologist's report. "Tom, this changes everything. If the source of the creek is on your property, you do not just have senior water rights, you have exclusive water rights. Legally, Willowbrook Heights has no claim to that water at all." What does that mean? It means Rebecca Morrison just spent $2 million building an irrigation system. She has no legal right to operate. And it means we can shut her down completely. But before we could act on this information, Rebecca made her biggest mistake yet. I had planned to spend Thanksgiving week visiting my daughter in Colorado, but a snowstorm canceled my flight, and I decided to drive instead. What I did not tell anyone was that I had changed my plans again at the last minute and decided to come home early. I had been on the road for 8 hours when I pulled into my driveway and found the auction in progress. Now I understood why Rebecca had been so confident lately. She was not planning to buy my property, she was planning to steal it through a fraudulent auction while I was out of town. The sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes of Rebecca's 911 call, but they did not get the reaction she was expecting. Deputy Martinez was a former Marine who had served under my command in Afghanistan, and he recognized me immediately. "Colonel McKenna," he said, stepping out of his patrol car. "What is going on here?" "That is what I would like to know, Martinez. I come home from a trip to find this woman auctioning off my ranch." Rebecca pushed forward, still clutching her microphone. "Officers, this man is disrupting a legal foreclosure auction. He is making threats and scaring our bidders." "Foreclosure auction." Martinez looked confused. "Ma'am, do you have documentation authorizing this sale?" Rebecca produced a thick folder with what appeared to be legal documents. "Mr. McKenna defaulted on several HOA assessments and environmental compliance fees. Under Texas property law, we have the right to recover our costs through foreclosure proceedings." Martinez examined the papers while I pulled out my phone and called Emma. She answered on the first ring. "Tom, I thought you were in Colorado." "Change of plans." "Emma, there is an auction happening on my property right now. Rebecca Morrison is claiming I defaulted on HOA fees, and they are foreclosing." The silence on the other end of the line lasted about 5 seconds. When Emma spoke again, her voice was deadly calm. "Tom, my ranch has never been subject to HOA jurisdiction. There are no valid HOA fees, which means there can be no valid default, which means this auction is completely fraudulent. Do not let anyone leave. I am calling the DA's office right now." Martinez was still examining Rebecca's documents when I hung up. "Ma'am," he said, "I am not seeing any court orders here." "Who authorized this foreclosure?" "The HOA board voted to pursue all available remedies for non-payment," Rebecca said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "But ma'am, HOA foreclosures require court approval in Texas. Do you have a court order?" That is when Rebecca made her fatal error. Instead of admitting she did not have court authorization, she doubled down. "Officer, this is a private community matter. The HOA has full authority to enforce its assessments within the development boundaries." "Except my property is not within your development boundaries," I said quietly. "It never has been." Martinez looked from Rebecca to me and back again. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to shut down this auction until we can verify the legal authority. And I am going to need everyone here to provide identification for our report." Rebecca's face went white. "You cannot shut down a legal proceeding." "Ma'am, if this proceeding is not legal, then it is fraud. And fraud is a felony." That is when the auctioneer, a nervous man who had obviously been hired without being told the details, stepped forward. "Officers, I was hired to conduct an estate sale. Nobody told me this was a foreclosure or that there was any dispute about ownership." "Who hired you?" Martinez asked. The auctioneer pointed at Rebecca. "She did. Paid cash for a standard estate auction. Said the owner had died and the family wanted to liquidate quickly." Martinez turned to Rebecca with the expression of a man who had just solved a puzzle. "Ma'am, you told this gentleman that Mr. McKenna was dead." Rebecca's lawyer, yes, she had brought a lawyer to her fraudulent auction, finally spoke up. "Officers, there has obviously been some miscommunication here. My client was under the impression that the property was abandoned and subject to HOA remediation procedures." "Abandoned," I stepped forward. "I have been living here for 4 years. My mail gets delivered here. My taxes are current. I have got utility bills, insurance policies, and county records, all showing continuous occupancy. What exactly made you think this property was abandoned?" That is when Rebecca finally lost her composure completely. "You were gone," she shrieked. Nobody answered the door. There were no lights at night. The property was clearly vacant. "I was gone for 6 days," I said calmly. "Since when is 6 days considered abandonment?" Emma arrived just as a second sheriff's unit pulled up, followed by an unmarked car that I recognized as belonging to the district attorney's office. The crowd of auction attendees was getting restless, and several people were demanding to know what was happening to the money they had already bid. Emma surveyed the scene with the expression of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. She walked directly to Martinez and introduced herself, then turned to Rebecca's lawyer. "Counselor, I am going to assume you were not aware that your client was conducting a fraudulent auction on property. She has no legal claim to. I would strongly suggest you distance yourself from this situation before it becomes a criminal matter." Rebecca's lawyer took one look at the DA's investigator, who was now photographing the auction setup, and made a wise decision. "My client and I need to consult privately," he said, and walked rapidly toward his car. Rebecca found herself standing alone, still holding her microphone, as the full weight of her situation began to sink in. The investigator from the DA's office approached her with a badge and a recording device. "Ma'am, I am Investigator Johnson with the Travis County District Attorney's Office. I need to ask you some questions about this auction. You have the right to remain silent." The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Rebecca Morrison was arrested on charges of fraud, criminal trespass, and filing false documents. The auction was declared void, and all money collected was returned to the bidders. The auctioneer, who had been genuinely deceived, provided a sworn statement about how Rebecca had misrepresented the sale, but the real satisfaction came when Emma filed our countersuit. "We are going for everything she told me the next morning. Fraud, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, abuse of process, and violation of your civil rights. The geologist's report about the creek source gives us leverage to demand they shut down their entire irrigation system until they can prove legal water access, which they cannot." The case never went to trial. 3 weeks after the failed auction, Willowbrook Heights Insurance Company settled for $2.3 million and agreed to purchase alternative water rights from the county. Rebecca Morrison was fired as HOA president and eventually pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for 5 years of probation and a permanent restraining order, preventing her from contacting me or setting foot on my property. The HOA board replaced her with a retired engineer named Bill Henderson, who knocked on my door on a cold January morning, carrying a bottle of bourbon and an apology. "Mr. McKenna," he said, "I want you to know that not everyone in Willowbrook Heights supported what Rebecca did. Most of us just wanted to live peacefully and let our neighbors do the same. I am hoping we can start over and be good neighbors. I invited him in for coffee, and we spent an hour talking about water conservation, rotational grazing, and the wildlife corridor my land provided between the creek and the hill country beyond. By the time he left, we had worked out an informal agreement where I would provide environmental education programs for HOA residents in exchange for their help monitoring the creek for pollution or invasive species. Rebecca Morrison left Texas 6 months later. I heard she moved to Arizona, where she presumably found new victims for her particular brand of tyranny, but she left behind something valuable, a cautionary tale that spread throughout the county about what happens when HOA power goes unchecked. These days, McKenna Ranch is more peaceful than it has ever been. The cattle graze freely along Cottonwood Creek, the wildflowers bloom without interference, and my access road remains clear. I have started hosting school groups for environmental education, and Emma Rodriguez serves on my advisory board for property rights issues. Sometimes I stand on my front porch at sunset and think about my grandfather, who fought to keep this land in the family through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. He never could have imagined that the greatest threat to McKenna Ranch would come from a suburban HOA president with too much time and too little sense. But he would have been proud of how it ended. The land remains free, the water flows clean, and justice delayed, but not denied, was finally served. Rebecca Morrison learned the hard way that you cannot auction off a man's heritage, no matter how fancy your letterhead or how big your legal fund. Some things, family land, water rights, and the principle that a man's home is his castle, are not for sale at any price.